A narcissist never truly escapes the bond they themselves have broken. They may leave on a behavioral level, disappear from your life, cut off all outward forms of contact. But on a deeper level, the psychological level, that bond does not end. It does not dissolve, nor is it properly closed. It is merely pushed into the shadow, where it continues to exist in a more primitive, more obsessive, and less controllable form. When a bond is not processed through awareness, it does not die. It changes shape and begins to operate from the unconscious. According to Carl Jung, anything that is not made conscious, not faced and integrated, does not disappear from psychic life. It returns from the unconscious as compulsive repetition, persistent obsession, or a kind of psychological fate that one cannot understand or escape. And here lies a crucial point that many people are never clearly told. The bond between you and a narcissist is not an ordinary emotional relationship that can simply be ended by breaking up. It is an unconscious attachment structure formed through projection, dependency, and the use of another person to regulate the ego from the outside. When that structure is broken without inner integration, it does not end, it becomes a trap. What hurts you the most, therefore, is often not that they left, but that they seem to leave so easily, that they replaced you so quickly, that all the depth, presence, and what you gave appears to have left no trace. But this very feeling obscures a more important truth. The person who replaces most quickly is often the one who has never truly left on the inside. If the bond had been processed, if it had been closed through awareness, responsibility, and confrontation with inner truth, there would be no need to run so fast. Urgency is always a sign of avoidance, not of freedom. That is why, in this video, we are not talking about love in a romantic or moral sense. We are also not talking about karma as punishment or spiritual consolation. We are going deeper into the psychological structure that forces the narcissist to break the bond, and why that very act imprisons them far longer than you might think. The focus lies in a core Jungian paradox. A bond is not destroyed by leaving behaviorally. It dissolves only when it is integrated into consciousness. And because the narcissist cannot tolerate facing the inner void, primordial shame, and the truth that their ego is borrowed from others, they are unable to do this. One thing must be placed correctly from the very beginning. This video is not meant to make you feel that you have won, nor to nurture hope that they will somehow pay a dramatic price. The truth is far more subtle. You do not need their collapse in order to be free. And they do not need you to return in order to remain trapped in that bond. These are two separate journeys. When you dare to face pain, you begin to leave the bond. When they continue to avoid pain, they are pulled deeper into it. And by the end of this journey, what matters most is not where the narcissist is, who they are with, or how they appear from the outside. What matters is that you correctly understand the nature of this bond. So you no longer have to wonder why memories of you still haunt them, why they cannot fully disappear, and why your sovereign silence is what slowly dissolves that structure. Because the final paradox is this: the one who breaks the bond by running away becomes trapped within it. The one who leaves through awareness is the one who becomes free. If you are ready to look at that truth, not to blame, not to hope for their change, but to understand and close it from your side, then we begin. Part 1. The bond is not love. It is a psychological structure. To understand why a narcissist cannot escape the bond they themselves have broken, the first thing that must be clarified is this. This bond was never love in the conventional sense. Many people confuse the bond with feelings, memories, romantic attachment, and therefore believe that with enough time or with the arrival of someone new, everything will naturally end. But the bond we are discussing here does not operate on the surface emotional level. It is a deep psychological structure, formed even before love had a chance to emerge, and it exists independently of whether the relationship continues or has ended. According to Carl Jung, some bonds are not built on the meeting of two mature egos, but on an unconscious attachment between the unintegrated parts of two people. In the case of a narcissist, the bond does not form because they love you, but because they need you to stabilize their own ego. You do not enter their life as an independent individual, but as a psychological function, a mirror, a support, an external emotional regulation system. In the early stages, this structure is often covered by expressions that closely resemble love. Intense attention, near miraculous harmony, the feeling of being seen, understood, chosen. But on a deeper level, what is happening is not a two-way connection, but projection. The narcissist does not see you as you are. They see in you an idealized version of themselves, or a part of the ego they cannot hold on their own. And you, especially if you are an empath, tend to unconsciously accept that role, not because you are weak, but because of your capacity for empathy and containment. This is where the bond begins to form. It is not based on equal exchange, but on an unconscious contract. You carry for them what they cannot carry themselves. You help regulate their emotions, confirm their value, soothe their shame, shield the inner void. In return, you receive a sense of connection, meaning, and the role of being irreplaceable. But because this bond is not built on awareness and responsibility, it is unstable. It depends entirely on you continuing to hold that role. As time passes and you begin to show up as a real person with boundaries, needs, and your own truth, this bond structure becomes dangerous for the narcissist. Because at that point, the mirror no longer reflects the image they need. Your authentic presence begins to collide with their borrowed ego. And this is the critical moment. The bond does not collapse because of a lack of love, but because it begins to expose the truth. What must be understood is this. The narcissist does not break the bond because they no longer need you. They break it because they need you too much, so much that your real existence becomes a threat. At this stage, the bond is no longer a source of stability, but a trigger for primordial shame and the fear of exposure. Breaking the bond here is not a mature act. It is a psychological survival reflex. And because the bond was never built as a conscious relationship, breaking up does not end it. When the behavioral act of leaving occurs, the internal structure remains intact. The narcissist carries the bond into their unconscious, where it continues to operate in the form of obsession, comparison, silent monitoring, and repetitive cycles with new partners. The bond does not disappear when the relationship ends. It simply loses its original form and becomes shadow. On your side, if you are the one who dares to face the pain, the bond begins to loosen. But on their side, because the bond is a source of ego regulation, losing it creates a void they cannot tolerate. And from here, the paradox begins to emerge. The one who leaves behaviorally becomes the one who is psychologically bound. The one who stays with the pain has the opportunity for liberation. The one who runs from pain carries the bond as a nameless burden. In the next part, we will go deeper into why the narcissist is compelled to break the bond, and why that very moment marks a point of no return in their psychological structure, not because they lose you, but because the bond begins to reflect a truth they cannot face. Part 2, why they are forced to break the bond, when the connection becomes a threat. At a certain point, the bond is no longer a refuge for the narcissist. What once stabilized them begins to threaten them. This is the pivotal moment that many people misunderstand. The narcissist does not break the bond because they have grown stronger, but because the bond has begun to reflect the truth. When the connection functions smoothly, they feel supported, validated, and externally held together. But as you gradually step out of that unconscious role, when you develop boundaries, a voice, and your own truth, the structure of the bond reverses. It no longer shields them. it illuminates. In depth psychology, the borrowed ego, the false self, can only exist as long as there is sufficient mirroring. When that mirroring falls out of sync, or when the mirror refuses to reflect illusion, primordial shame rises. This is not ordinary sadness or disappointment, but existential panic, the sensation that the self is disintegrating. At this stage, the bond activates the fear of exposure, of being seen through, of being forced to take responsibility for the inner void. For this reason, the act of breaking the bond does not stem from malice or indifference, but from a psychological survival reflex. The narcissist must cut off the dangerous source of mirroring in order to preserve their fragile ego structure. They do not choose to leave in a conscious sense. They are compelled to leave in order to avoid confrontation. In that moment, breaking the bond is experienced as self-rescue, severing what makes them feel naked, vulnerable, and out of control. But here lies the great paradox. The way they break the bond determines how they become trapped within it. When a bond is ended through avoidance, denial, and blame, no integration occurs. There is no inner acknowledgement, no emotional responsibility, no acceptance of shame as part of maturation. As a result, the bond is not closed, it is frozen in the shadow. And whatever is frozen in the shadow continues to live, but in a distorted form. At this stage, many people observe the outward phenomena and misunderstand the essence. They see the narcissist enter a new relationship very quickly, change environments efficiently, construct a new narrative convincingly. But none of this is a sign of liberation. It is evidence of organized flight. Rapid replacement does not mean the bond has ended. It means the bond refuses to fall silent. Each new relationship is not a beginning, but an attempt to recreate mirroring in order to extinguish the feeling of exposure. What is rarely spoken is this. When the bond is broken, at the very moment it begins to reflect truth, the narcissist loses the only chance to exit it in a healthy way. Had they stayed, endured the discomfort, accepted shame, and faced the reality of the ego, the bond could have dissolved through integration. But because they choose avoidance, the bond does not dissolve, it transforms into obsessive control. It persists as silent monitoring, constant comparison, narrative rewriting, and delayed impulses to return. More importantly, the moment they break the bond is also the moment your role changes. You are no longer regulating them, and this creates a void they cannot fill on their own. This void does not come from losing you as a person, but from losing a psychological function they never learned to perform themselves. The bond, once a stabilizing tool, now becomes living proof of a dependency they cannot acknowledge. Thus, breaking the bond does not lead them to freedom, it leads them into a more subtle loop, the loop of the shadow. There, the bond no longer lives in the light of relationship, but in the darkness of the psyche, persistent, uncontrollable, and impossible to escape through behavior alone. And from here, the paradox becomes clear. Leaving behaviorally ends the relationship. It does not end the bond. Part 3. The core paradox. Breaking the bond does not end it. It freezes it in the shadow. This is the point that many people are never told directly. Breaking a bond does not mean the bond ends. In fact, in the case of the narcissist, the act of breaking the connection is often the moment the bond becomes most entrenched, not externally, but internally. When a bond is cut through avoidance rather than awareness, it is not released. It is frozen in the shadow, where it continues to exist as an invisible yet persistent force, shaping behavior and perception in ways even the person carrying it cannot understand. From the perspective of Carl Jung, the shadow is not a place where something bad is discarded. The shadow contains experiences that were never fully lived, never understood, and never integrated. A bond broken in panic, shame, and denial does not dissolve. It becomes a psychological knot, an unfinished experience with no inner closure. And anything without closure in the psyche tends to return. This is why, after breaking the bond, the narcissist does not experience true relief. What they feel is only temporary silence, a void quickly covered by activity, new people, new images. But beneath that motion, the bond remains intact. It no longer exists as a relationship, but as a psychological imprint. There is no dialogue, yet there is reaction. No presence, yet comparison persists. No direct connection, yet silent surveillance remains. What must be understood is this: the bond does not survive on romantic memory, it survives on function. While the bond existed within the relationship, you regulated the narcissist's ego. When the bond is broken, that function does not disappear, it becomes a deficit. And it is this deficit that creates a counterpull. The narcissist does not miss you as a person. They are pulled back by instability, by the absence of a structure that once held them together. At this stage, the bond no longer operates as connection, but as obsession. It manifests in behaviors outsiders struggle to understand. Indirect information checking, comparing you to new partners, rewriting the story to soften shame, or even denying your importance entirely while being unable to stop thinking about you. This is not contradiction. This is the shadow at work. The shadow always speaks through actions that consciousness refuses to admit. Here lies the paradox. The more the narcissist tries to escape the bond through behavior, the more tightly they become bound psychologically. Each new relationship does not erase the old bond. It merely numbs the sense of lack. And because there is no integration, that lack returns often stronger, more chaotic, and harder to control. The bond is no longer attached to a specific person, but to an inner state, the state of being mirrored, supported, and allowed to exist through another. Meanwhile, on your side, if you face the pain, the bond begins to move. Pain forces awareness, questioning, self-restructuring, and this very process loosens the bond. But for the narcissist, because the bond holds what they cannot tolerate, facing it would mean confronting primordial shame and inner emptiness. That is why they cannot do it. The bond remains in the shadow alive but unseen, present but unnamed. And this is what confuses so many people. The bond is strongest not when two people are together, but when it is broken without integration. While in the relationship, the bond has form, language, interaction. When pushed into the shadow, it loses form but not force. It becomes an underground current, influencing choices, emotions, and future relationships without ever appearing openly. In the next part, we will explore another major illusion: why a new partner can never break this bond, and why rapid replacement is not proof of release, but evidence that the bond continues to operate in a quieter and more dangerous way within the narcissist's psychological life. Part 4. Why a new person can never break the bond. After the bond is broken, what often hurts you the most is not the separation itself, but what happens immediately afterward. They move on to someone new far too quickly. So quickly that you begin to doubt everything you once experienced. So quickly that you question whether you ever truly mattered, or whether you were ultimately just a role that could be easily replaced. Yet this very moment is where the nature of the bond is most often misunderstood. The new person does not appear to replace you. They appear to relieve the inner pressure left behind by the bond. When the bond is broken, the narcissist does not enter a tolerable state of emptiness. That emptiness is too terrifying. It is not merely loneliness, it is the loss of grounding, the loss of mirroring, the loss of a structure that once held the ego together. The new person is brought in not because new love has formed, but because the old system is missing a crucial component needed to keep functioning. This explains why new relationships often begin with great speed, high intensity, and an appearance of being very fine. Not because they learned anything from the previous relationship, but because they are trying to recreate as quickly as possible a familiar feeling, the feeling of being mirrored, supported, and externally validated. In the early stage, the new person is not a full human being in their psyche, but a temporary solution to an instability that is quietly burning underneath. But one thing is crucial. The new person does not step into the old bond, they only stand beside its shadow. The true bond does not exist between two people. It exists within a psychological structure that was formed long before. Therefore, no matter how good, new, or willing the new person may be, they cannot touch the core of the deficit. They can soothe the surface, but they cannot fill the void where the old bond once operated. For this reason, the new person does not break the bond. They inadvertently activate it. Each time the narcissist compares, each time they need to prove that they are fine, each time they secretly look back at the past or silently monitor you, the old bond is fed a little more. Not because they want to return, but because the bond was never resolved at its root. It remains there as an unfinished structure, constantly demanding resolution, yet never being faced directly. This is also why so many of the narcissist's new relationships repeat the same script, even as the characters change. First comes idealization, then cracks appear, then disappointment, control, and finally rupture. Not because the new person is not enough, but because the old bond continues to dictate how attachment occurs. When a structure has not been closed, it will keep recreating itself in different forms. On your side, this is often misperceived. You see them with someone new and assume the bond is gone. But in reality, the opposite is true. The bond is strongest precisely when they feel compelled to prove that it no longer exists. The urgency, the performance of happiness, the emphasis on a new beginning, all are signs that the bond is still exerting pressure from within. If the bond had truly dissolved, there would be no need to display that fact to anyone. And the key point is this: the new person cannot break the bond you once had because that bond was never in anyone else's hands. It can only dissolve when the one who carries it is willing to face the inner void rather than filling it with someone new. Until that happens, the bond remains intact, not as a relationship, but as a psychological imprint that continues to shape choices, emotions, and subsequent attachments. Part 5. When the bond becomes a prison, the silent loop they cannot escape. Once the bond is no longer sustained by the relationship and cannot be replaced by a new person, it begins to shift into another form, more subtle, quieter, but far more persistent. At this stage, the bond no longer functions as a connection, but as a closed psychological space in which the narcissist becomes trapped alongside the very things they try to escape. From the outside, everything may appear normal, even stable, but internally, an invisible loop is gradually tightening. The danger of this stage lies here. The bond no longer requires your presence to exist. It has been internalized. It becomes a self-operating mechanism in which memory, comparison, fantasy, and control replace real interaction. The narcissist does not need to speak with you for the bond to remain alive. They only need to think about you in a way that allows them to maintain a sense of control, or at least avoid confronting genuine loss. In this state, the bond begins to distort. It no longer takes the shape of longing, but of surveillance. Not surveillance in order to return, but to ensure that the story they have constructed remains intact. They need to know how you are living, not out of care, but because your independent existence threatens to collapse how they understand themselves. If you are suffering, their narrative is reinforced. If you are at peace, the bond is triggered more strongly because it touches the void they never processed. It is here that a new loop forms: comparison, self-reassurance, instability, indirect control. The narcissist constantly compares the new person to you, not to decide who is better, but to recover a lost sense of stability. But because the new person cannot reach the core of the bond, this comparison never ends. It only changes targets. Each failed comparison demands another act of reassurance, performing happiness, retelling the story in a favorable way, or convincing themselves that you were never important. The problem is this: the more reassurance is needed, the more it reveals inner instability. A psyche that has truly closed does not need to repeat the same affirmation. But a bond pushed into the shadow is different. It constantly demands to be handled, yet because there is no direct path, it can only be temporarily soothed through behavior, and each such behavior feeds the loop a little more. At this stage, many people mistake the narcissist's silence for letting go. But silence is not always an ending. Sometimes it is the most refined form of control. Without direct interaction, the narcissist keeps the bond alive by holding you in the mind in your former role, the one who mirrored, carried, and stabilized them. You no longer exist as a real person, but as an inner reference point. And this is precisely what makes the bond harder to die. Alongside surveillance, another less visible process unfolds: rewriting memory. The narcissist cannot allow the bond to exist as it truly was, because its truth is too dangerous. So memory is edited, deep moments are diminished, your contributions are blurred. The harm you endured is role reversed. This is not deliberate, lying in the ordinary sense, but a survival effort. If memory is not rewritten, the bond will continue to trigger shame and instability. But edited memory does not weaken the bond, it hardens it. When an experience is distorted rather than understood, it cannot dissolve. It becomes a compressed psychological mass, coexisting with present life and exerting constant pressure. And because this pressure has no healthy outlet, the narcissist gradually lives in a state of baseline tension, not exactly in pain, but never truly at peace. What must be seen is this: at this point, the bond is no longer directly about you. It is about their inability to carry themselves. You are simply the last form the bond took before it was broken. Therefore, even if you completely disappear from their real life, the bond continues to exist as an abstract structure, a sense that something is unfinished, unresolved, unsettled, yet unreachable. On your side, if you have entered the process of facing and integrating, the bond slowly dissolves. But on their side, the bond becomes a closed space, neither opening nor disappearing. This is the invisible prison. No bars, no locks, yet no exit. Because the only exit facing the inner void is what they cannot tolerate. Over time, this loop produces a deeper consequence: inner constriction. The narcissist increasingly lives within familiar stories, repetitive reactions, and function-based relationships. Vitality fades. Genuine curiosity disappears. Every connection carries the scent of performance. And the old bond, though no longer named, continues to silently shape how they relate to the world. This is why many narcissists can go very far outwardly, changing cities, jobs, partners, while remaining internally stagnant. The bond does not allow them to move forward, but it also does not allow them to return. It holds them in suspension, always needing something external to feel okay, yet never truly satisfied. And the more they try to fill the void, the clearer the void becomes. At this point, one important clarification must be made. This is not punishment, nor karma in a moral sense. It is the natural psychological consequence of breaking an attachment structure without integrating it. No one does this to them. not you, not fate. Their avoidance of truth is what built the prison. And the final paradox of this section is this: the bond truly imprisons only one side. You may have suffered deeply, but if you dare to stay with the pain, you opened the possibility of transformation. They did not. For you, the bond is a passage. For them, the bond is a state of entrapment. The same bond, but two completely different psychological destinies. Part 6, Two Separate Paths. Why you can leave the bond, but they cannot. At this point, what must be faced directly is no longer whether the bond is strong or weak, nor whether the narcissist feels pain or does not. The core issue lies in how each person carries that bond internally. The same connection opens into two completely different psychological paths, and it is precisely here that the difference between liberation and entrapment becomes unmistakable. What allows you to leave the bond is not the fact that they disappear, nor the fact that you understand how bad they are. It comes from something far more subtle. You have the capacity to stay with the feeling of loss without needing to fill it immediately. When the bond collapses, you do not have an avoidance mechanism strong enough to cover the pain with a new story. You are forced to feel, forced to move through emptiness, hollowness, even confusion about yourself. Yet this very staying, however difficult, is what creates movement. In the early stage, this often does not feel like healing. It feels like disintegration. You lose your direction. The roles that once defined you no longer hold. The raw question arises: who am I when this bond is no longer here? But unlike the narcissist, you do not try to cover that question with another person. You may want to desperately, but you cannot. And it is precisely this inability that creates a new inner space, the space of restructuring. Within that space, the bond is no longer fed through behavior, it begins to be understood. You look back at the moments that made you believe it was love. You recognize the places where you cared for them, endured for them, absorbed for them. You begin to see clearly the boundary between genuine connection and an unconscious role. The bond, once a living experience, gradually becomes an object of awareness. And when an experience is seen clearly, it begins to lose its power to control. On the other side, the narcissist follows the opposite path. They do not allow the bond to become something they can observe. For them, the bond must either be maintained or completely denied. There is no middle ground. And without a middle ground, there is no transformation. The bond is not moved through, it is framed. They neither live with it nor release it. They carry it as a rigid, inflexible structure that always must be controlled. This leads to another crucial difference. You change how you exist in the world. They merely change the stage. After the bond, you cannot return to the old way of loving, attaching, and giving energy. Not because you are colder, but because you are more awake. You sense more clearly when you are being pulled into a familiar role. You recognize earlier the signs of misalignment, and this sensitivity leaves the old bond with no ground to cling to. The narcissist is the opposite. Because the bond was never processed from within, they continue to seek external structures that can replace the old function. But because the core problem remains unchanged, every new attachment takes the same shape. They may change their presentation, learn more healthy language, even adjust surface behavior. But underneath, the motive is still to avoid the void. And as long as that void is not touched, the old bond continues to shape every choice. One very important point must be made clearly here. You do not leave the bond because you are stronger than they are, but because you accept becoming weaker for a period of time. You allow yourself to be unsteady. You allow yourself not to have answers immediately. You allow inner silence to exist without needing to fill it. The narcissist cannot. For them, being unsteady equals the risk of collapse, and so they never enter the transitional stage. And without transition, There is no liberation. Over time, this difference accumulates. In you, the bond becomes a memory placed in its proper position, not denied, but no longer governing. It is part of the journey, not the center of your inner life. In them, the bond becomes an unspoken standard against which all later experiences are measured. Not named, yet always present. Not acknowledged, yet always influential. That is why your silence has radically different effects on each side. For you, silence is the space in which inner sovereignty is restored. You no longer need to react in order to exist. You do not need to be seen in order to feel valuable. The bond dissolves because you no longer feed it. For the narcissist, your silence does not create peace. It creates disorientation, not because they miss you, but because the structure that once revolved around you has lost its anchor. At this stage, many people expect a dramatic moment of realization, but that rarely happens in that way. Instead, what follows is a long sequence of repetition and deadlock. The narcissist may continue living, connecting, and building an image, but that life becomes increasingly functional rather than experiential. The old bond does not allow depth, but it also does not allow stopping. It keeps them operating, not living. And for you, as the bond dissolves, something else happens. You begin to feel fullness without attaching it to anyone. Not ecstatic happiness, but steadiness. You stop seeking validation through intensity. You realize that genuine connection does not have to exhaust you. And from that position, the old bond is no longer appealing. It is no longer something you would return to, even if the opportunity existed. And here is the crystallized point of this section. The bond does not imprison the one who loved more. It imprisons the one who cannot be alone with themselves. You moved through the void. They did not. You allowed the bond to dissolve by fully living the pain. They kept the bond alive by fleeing it. These two strategies lead to two completely different outcomes. By the end of this journey, what matters most is not how the narcissist lived after the bond was broken, nor whether they regret it or not. All of that, ultimately, is only external expression. The real value of this story lies in the quiet but decisive shift that has taken place inside you. The moment you stop trying to understand them, save them, or wait for acknowledgement from them, the bond begins to lose the foundation on which it existed. The bond never lived on love, memory, or time. It lived on participation. As long as you still reacted, still hoped, still searched for explanations, the bond was still being fed. But when you withdraw from that role, not through anger, not through punishment, but through clarity, the bond has nowhere to cling. It is not cut off dramatically. It starves to death in silence. And that is the only way an unconscious attachment structure truly dissolves. There is a profound paradox here that many people only understand after they have gone very far. You do not need them to understand you in order to be free. You also do not need their apology, their change, or their recognition of your value. If those things happen, they belong to their journey, not yours. Your freedom does not come from someone else's reaction. It comes from no longer placing yourself inside a structure that was never designed for peace. When the bond dissolves on your side, what remains is not the emptiness you once feared. What remains is a new inner space where you begin to feel yourself without mirroring, where your presence no longer depends on someone needing you to stabilize them, where connection no longer means exhaustion. And from this space, you begin to understand something entirely different about love. Real love does not require you to disappear so that someone else can feel they exist. On the narcissist side, the bond may still remain not as a relationship, but as a psychological trace that has never been closed. But that is no longer your responsibility. You do not carry that bond anymore. You do not hold the role of mirror, anchor, or regulator for a structure that cannot stand on its own. The two paths have separated, and this separation does not require confrontation or declaration. It happens quietly, but definitively. And here is the final crystallization of the entire journey. The one who breaks the bond through escape will be trapped in what they refuse to face. The one who leaves the bond through awareness will carry a freedom no one can take away. Not because you are stronger, but because you stayed with the truth long enough for it to lose its power over you. If there is one thing to keep after this video, it is not judgment and not the feeling of victory. It is clarity. Clarity that what you went through was not weakness, but an awakening process. Clarity that the bond that once bound you was not destiny, but a structure that can dissolve when you no longer participate. And clarity that sovereign silence is not avoidance, it is the highest act of freedom. If you have made it this far, it means the bond has already begun to lose its power. Not because they changed, but because you changed your position within this story. And from that position, the road ahead no longer revolves around escaping someone else. It revolves around returning to yourself, whole, awake, and no longer bound by connections that were never born from real love.